Hello, peoples, and welcome to Esoterica Cinema, the program where we take films and discuss the hell out of them. My name is Jason Peters, and with me, as always, is the man who was once arrested in an international court of law for a misunderstanding involving jackfruit, Mr. Ryan Seybold.
Ooh, what's up, Jason? How's it going, buddy?
Doing well, man. Doing well. I am really excited to finally get into our Powell and Pressburger series here today.
Hell yeah.
Obviously, very sharp right turn from our previous series, which was body horror. And, you know, these are two guys who I've been really wanting to check out for a long time and can't wait to do so over the next 4 or 5 films with you. Ryan, do you have a description of our film today, sir?
I do. Today's film is the 1943 classic, The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp. Very loosely based on a British comic strip character, Colonel Blimp, created by David Lowe, this film tells the life story of a fictional Major General Clive Wynn-Candy, covering a 40-year span between 1902 and 1942, and all of the close personal relationships and experiences that formed him along the way into the old man he would become. It encompasses so many genres and themes, as it is at times a lighthearted comedy, but also a heartfelt drama, political satire, war propaganda, or perhaps anti-propaganda, a star-crossed love story, and a whole lot of intercontinental bromance with his German pal Theo Kretschmar-Schuldorf. The film was made by Michael Powell and Emerich Pressburger, who share equal titles of writer, director, and producer under the production banner of The Archers over their time together from the late 30s through 1957. Colonel Blimp stars Roger Livesey as General Wynn-Candy, Deborah Kerr, who covers 3 separate roles, we're going to talk about that here shortly, and Anton Walbrook as Theo. It was made on a budget of £200,000, which was pretty large for its time, and was one of the earlier uses of Technicolor. I could go on about this film for 40 years, but I'm going to park it right there for now because war starts at midnight.
War starts at midnight.
And I got to ask you as always, Jason, what did you think about this movie, bud?
Ryan, gonna be happy to discuss that with you right here today. The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp has a reputation as one of cinema's finest films, with it being ranked 45 on the most recent BFI list of best British movies of all time.
Wow.
It's the 5th collaboration of Michael Powell and Emerich Pressburger, whose films A Matter of Life and Death and 49th Parallel are 2 that I have seen and very much love. Now, I recognize that history and the critical community are on this film's side, which is why it was so disheartening to find myself bored and uninterested as I sat through nearly 3 hours of a plodding, mediocre, lackluster experience. It spends so much time saying so very little, most egregiously with regard to Colonel Blimp himself, who is in virtually every scene in the film, and yet is drawn so shallowly and with such narcissism, I didn't care at all about him, one way or another. I didn't like him, I didn't dislike him, did not care for him, so I did not want to spend 3 hours with this dude, and he was just constantly there. Now, this is not to say that the film is not filled with some wonderful moments, okay? From what's a heartfelt and stirring monologue by Anton Walbrook, who you called out as Theo, to one of the most unique and clever passage of time sequences that I've actually ever seen in cinema. It's a film I really wanted to like. And while technically speaking, this is a virtuoso performance of camera work and set design and score, I can admit all of that 100%. At the end of the day, what's the worst aspect is that I didn't care a lick about the life or death, or anything else about Colonel Blimp.
Oof.
Ryan, how about you, sir?
Oh, my heart is broken, my friend.
Sorry, man. I know. I've seen, several of their films, and I loved all of them. And this was, I was just as heartbroken as you. Let me tell you that. So, but what about you, man?
Well, Jason, I'm going to bring back an old staple of this show that we liked to call Cinematic Confessions, where we get super vulnerable here and admit a flaw in our movie street cred. My cinematic confession today is that I had never seen a Powell and Pressburger film, so I was quite eager to dive right into this series. I went into this movie blind, having never seen a trailer and knew very little about it. Jason, to say that I love this film would be an understatement. I adored this film.
Wow.
I felt so strongly about it that I was nervous to do this show today because I wanted to make sure to assort my thoughts properly so I do this whole bit justice. The characters were completely captivating, the script was way more than I ever expected, and it was all brought together by the department heads, namely the cinematography of both Georges Paranal and Jack Cardiff, the whimsical music of Alan Gray, and the production design of Alfred Young. The set design was so grandiose, and to think they filmed all of this while a world war was going on outside just warps my brain. But even when you strip away the bombast and Technicolor achievements, you're still left with an incredibly personal tale for Powell and Pressburger, as they in many ways mirror our two protagonists, along with many of the top crew who were German or Austrian refugees who'd escaped Nazism. This was a heartfelt tale of a life well lived, idealized love lost, and an endearing friendship. Just like us.
Hey! Now, honestly, Ryan, I'm really glad that you enjoyed the film because, like, I had told you that I had seen A Matter of Life and Death and really loved that film, and then later watched 49th Parallel and, you know, these guys' reputation. So I didn't want things to start off on like a sour note for you. So I'm glad that you like this film because we've got several more of them. And I think, you know, relative to my experience with this one, that it's only going to get better and that you're going to like the other ones even future. But with our positions addressed, let's actually go ahead and break down in detail what we feel does and does not work about the film. So first note off the bat, like I said earlier, this is a gorgeous film. Not going to argue that.
Sure.
The photography and the subsequent restoration are actually so impressive that I like had to remind myself this film was from the early 40s and like not the 70s.
Right.
Everything just looked so crisp and clear and wonderful. And so, and you know, Powell and Pressburger kind of have a reputation for their films being gorgeous, and this one's no different. And you had mentioned that this time around they were working with George Perrinal to bring their vision to life. And
yes,
you know, we get some really exquisite shots, right? Like there's a really early on in that bathhouse sequence, even, you know, aside from the transition, there's like this really nice tracking shot that we see as they're like walking down. And one thing in particular I noticed a lot of were just these like perfectly paced and executed dolly push-ins.
Yes.
And I think they really worked those to the film's benefit, sort of like elevate the film's visual style. And look, you know, I said up top, I have issues with the characters and the pacing and the substance and, you know, some of the film's ideologies, but I can say with absolute certainty, the visual elements of this film are flawless. I would imagine you probably appreciated the photography to the same degree, yeah?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, from the opening shot where we start off in that bunker or barn of sorts, where we are upstairs peering through like a little, I don't know, passway or something like that. There's like a ladder that goes down and we're watching this whole scene play out. And there's like a dude kind of like sitting on the railing looking down, and we're kind of an OTS of him looking down into this scene. There's just the framing and staging of it all really kind of struck me as very unique, that the average film, especially from this era, would have just let that play out from ground level. You know, we just shoot into a crowd of dudes. Sure. Guy walks up, sir, blah, 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 guy shaving, you know, we attack at midnight. Okay. Play it as if it was real. Cool. But they said, no, let's not do that. Let's go upstairs and like shoot through that thing. And remember, you know, cameras were really big back then. And so to your point, a lot of the camera movement, notably, you know, the first scene that I noticed, it was in the cafe. There was just like tons of camera movement as we sweep around down the stairs to peer down into the group of Germans that have, you know, collaborated down there that he's getting ready to confront. And then we kind of sweep around as they send beers to the band to request songs and stuff. Lots of tracking shots, lots of cool camera movement, upstairs, downstairs, you know, and then, you know, even more than that, you know, a lot of the set design and production value, just, you know, these sets were enormous and just so beautiful, and they weren't afraid to shoot them wide. Remember, you know, this was all being made during World War II in 1942, 1943. So, you know, Britain was neck deep in it at this point, and this was after Dunkirk. You know, they were full-fledged into the, you know, conflict with Adolf Hitler. So, you know, to say that they could shoot on location was a no-go. So they had to shoot everything on set. And the sets were absolutely beautiful and lent themselves really well. It was almost a well-staged dance between the camera and the set design themselves and all the sets and stuff like that. So I thought it was amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, no problem with the visual elements of this movie whatsoever. But what I do want to pivot to very quickly, and again, I like that you have a different interpretation of this because I'm going to give you plenty of opportunities to explain and defend like your position, you know.
Yeah, you got me on my back foot
characters
here.
And how, I mean, not really. You know, like we're both sitting here and explaining how we responded to this character, you know,
sure.
and again, like if anything, I'm the one who's on the back foot because you have history and the critical community on your side. Like, I'm very much the outlier by not liking this film. Again, BFI's one of the 50 best British films of all time.
Sure.
David Mamet famously said, like, Colonel Blimp is one of his favorite characters of all time. And that's actually what I want to discuss with you right here is the character of Colonel Blimp. Because, again, I know that there's a lot of people that really love him, as you may or may not, but I found him to be particularly shallow and not necessarily very charming. Now, there are times where he's sort of like playfully stubborn and fearless, such as the scene you alluded to earlier, where he's in the German bar, yet he insists on having the orchestra play English standards to sort of, poke and prod at the German officers who are also trying to do the same thing by buying them beers and having them sent up and trying to get in before the other. So, there's this sort of like one-upmanship that they're trying to do. And, as such, we see that he is sort of like an arrogant character who's, kind of full of himself and always sees himself as right. And so, and look, when you're a military general, right, you have to have that confidence. You're leading men into battle. And I certainly understand that. But it kind of just comes across, to me as like haughty and stuffy and, like, okay, perfect example, okay? This is a guy who goes to his friend Theo, okay, who he dueled with earlier. And I love that setup, by the way, right? But there's a moment where he goes to Theo after Theo has been captured by English soldiers and put into a prisoner of war camp, okay?
Right.
And when Blimp goes to visit him, Theo, I would rightfully argue, kind of shuns him and turns away. Yeah. And this is so beyond the understanding and reasoning of Blimp. He's like, well, why is he so mad at me? He surely can't be the POW imprisoning. And it's like, do you have any idea what you've just done to your supposed friend? And then you're going to be like arrogant enough and like inward myopic enough to like not see that like your friend is upset that he was just captured as a prisoner of war. Like, come on, dude. Yeah. So tell me about your impression of Colonel Blimp and how that kind of maybe contrasts with mine.
I mean, I genuinely overall agree with you. Blimp was, or let's just call him by his character's name, Wynn-Candy. General Wynn-Candy was, we see him right out the gate, very gruff, almost like he reminded me of the walrus from Alice in Wonderland, from the walrus and the carpenter.
The time has come.
Right. The time has come.
The time has come.
We attack at midnight. Very, very similar. He had the big mustache and everything, very similar.
Yeah.
But then we go back and we see that, he was, a young man full of bravado. He was, a well-decorated soldier coming out of that Boer War, and wanted to stick up for his country and goes to Germany. And then through that, we see him softened by his relationship with Theo. Now, speaking to that scene in particular, when you talk about Theo being captured and hanging out by the lake or whatever, listening to music, kind of wistful and remorseful and just kind of taking it all in. And then Wynn-Candy kind of being insensitive about all of that. For Theo, the war was personal, but to Wynn-Candy, it was more of a game. The whole thing was a thing of gamesmanship. And that was a lesson that he had to learn the hard way, even later in life. Theo has a kind of a come to Jesus moment where he talks to him when he goes on the radio and he's declined after trying to talk about the war on Dunkirk, or the whole situation with Dunkirk and the retreat and everything. If Wynn-Candy lost the war or any of these wars, in the past, World War I or the Boer War or whatever, he still had the sanctuary of the British Empire to come home to. It's kind of like you win some, you lose some kind of situation. But when Theo lost, he lost everything. And, he lost his family. His kids didn't come to the funeral when his wife died and all of that. There was a lot of big, this is just a game to you vibes. You know what I mean? And so I would argue that the acting of Roger Livesey is what really makes him likable. The character himself doesn't have a lot of solid attributes, but Roger Livesey's performance gives him so much moxie and charisma that he's just fun and charismatic to watch on screen, right? So I think that has a lot to do with it. I could definitely see your conflict. I don't negate the fact that he's a flawed character, a flawed protagonist in many ways. Right down to the love story with Deborah Carr's character, starting with Edith and playing two other characters, because
Sure.
he's very selfish in that, they obviously have a lot of connection with her staying with him after the duel and making sure that he's cool and okay and healthy and getting back on track. And then he just kind of pieces out when Theo says, I love her. And he's like, great, that's awesome. One less thing for me to worry about. And then he takes off and then he's like, wait, no, I want that.
Actually.
Yeah. And that's kind of spoiled brat
goes off like
mentality,
rich
right?
kid. Yeah, exactly. The same thing.
It's very
like you
spoiled
took my
brat
toys,
mentality.
right?
And I think that is like reflective almost and probably intentionally so by Powell and Pressburger's work here to kind of portray the hubris and pompous nature of the British Empire at that time, and how the higher ups of the British Empire were so cocksure of their position in the world that because the whole reason he goes to Germany in the first place was because they were being criticized for having concentration camps and abuse charges and things like that from this Boer War that he was just coming back from as a well-decorated, good soldier, right? So then he comes back like, hey, I did it, right, guys? And then they're like, he sees just the slightest bit of criticism and he's like, man, fuck those cads. And then he, heads over to Germany to go, beat this dude up and stand up for the British, Empire and the British Army. So I think a lot of that was kind of built into the script as criticism, of Britain's stance in the world at that time by Powell and Pressburger, and was very intentional. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So I think that I don't know that it necessarily like adds up as far as I'm concerned, because on the one hand, so my understanding is that Clive is a character to be respected and for us to appreciate, and everybody talks about how likable he is, but we're sort of talking about all of these like lesser qualities. Now, in a certain respect and in a certain examination, we could be looking at, the character of a complicated man or something like that, right? But like, I don't think the filmmakers did that. Like, I don't think we really see him be like good or bad. Like, everything just always works out for this guy, right? So because of that, there's never sort of any sort of like learning from a lesson from anything, any sort of growth. And as a matter of fact, even if he doubles down on his lesser qualities, they do end up working out, right? So like, because of his old school soldiering that everyone like tells him that, you got to adjust. The Nazis are, not playing by the same rules. And we'll sort of, have a discussion about that theme a little bit later in more detail. But the fact of the matter is that, by sort of like sticking to his guns all the time, everything does work out. And then there's also a theme, again, that we can sort of explore a little bit in greater detail down the road. But I think a lot of the film is really sort of centered around this sort of like promoting the civility and manners of, our behavior, especially, in times of war, but also in times of peace. It's kind of interesting because, again, I don't see him growing, right? Like we talk about typically a protagonist arc, right? And, in my opinion, the Clive at the end of the movie is very similar to the Clive at the beginning. And we're not just talking about the time jump, but old Clive, I think, is very similar to young Clive. He maybe has, some thoughts on the matters, or, he has sort of reflects, but like, I don't think he's really changed as a person. Now, I will admit to you that I do agree that Theo is definitely the most likable character, and it's because he does have to face that hardship, and he does have a lot and then loses everything, and he goes up and he goes down, and his life is a sort of ebb and flow, and, he's constantly wrestling with trying to make the best of these bad situations and trying to remain positive while he loses everything. And so again, to your point from earlier, we see this guy struggling with all of this hardship. And so then when, Clive comes through and he's like, oh, what's wrong, mate? Isn't life grand? And it's like, well, no, because nothing bad ever happens to you. So you never have to like learn a lesson or be humbled or anything, and that's where Theo gets, that like great monologue, we talked about it sort of offline, where it's like that uninterrupted close up where the camera just sort of like pushes in and like really just lets him speak to the emotions of, post World War I lamentations of loss and the loss of his way of life and the loss of his wife and all of this.
My wife was English. She would have loved to come back to England, But it seemed to me that I would be letting down my country in its greatest need. And so she stayed at my side. When in summer 33 we found that we had lost our children to the Nazi party, and I was willing to come, she died. None of my sons came to her funeral. Heil Hitler.
I do want to pivot that over because you mentioned it earlier to the performances, because for me, that was actually something kind of as well. Like the performances for me outside. So Theo, I thought crushed it, right? I thought he should have, been nominated for an award, won. Like he did a great job bringing so much depth to this one character. But everyone else feels really one note. Roger Livesey is very charismatic. Like when he came out and he was doing his whole distinguished British gentleman thing, like that's great. It's very fun. I looked forward to spending time with that character, but then that was kind of all there was to the character. Again, I never felt like until the very, very end, I never saw a different side of Clive, and that's what I was looking for is depth to that character. And that's why at the top in my opening description, I said that I felt the character was rather shallowly drawn because
sure.
Again, there wasn't those moments. And then with regard to Deborah Kerr, I mean, look, playing 3 roles in once, fantastic. But I will say that they all did kind of feel like the same person. And you can let me know if you disagree with that. But I didn't feel like it was Peter Sellers in, Doctor Strangelove, which I understand is a very, very high bar. But the way that he creates 3 very distinct characters, right? I felt like she was basically just playing the same person 3 different times.
Right. I think that was intentional.
And so,
I don't think her characters were meant to really stand out. See, Wynn-Candy to me wasn't in love with Edith. He was in love with perhaps the idea of Edith. She was like a concept to him, right? So like Theo even says that she was a picture to Candy, but Theo grew old and had children with her. Like you just knew like this idealized version of her. Like you built up this idea in your head because you're, of your own hubris, like of what your idealized perfect woman was and made that her.
But you must not forget I saw Edith 31 years later than you. We grew old together. You understand?
Ah, yes, of course. But she was exactly like her.
Edith, goes on to marry Theo and they have a life together until she passes away. And then Theo is then, rejoined with General Clive, Wynn-Candy later in life. But then he goes on to marry this woman, Barbara, who he meets in a nunnery, if I'm not mistaken, and kind of imprints his whole Edith persona onto her and like, now you're my dream woman. But then when she passes away, he hangs her portrait up in his trophy room. And we're going to get to that discussion in a minute. That was a tremendous sequence, but almost like as if Barbara was just a trophy to him, right? Like he just owned things and like took over things. He was, again, a man of, hubris and tradition. We see that with all his animal trophy heads on all his walls. And then like right in the middle is Barbara's portrait and so forth. So he's just kind of a life collector of sorts. And you're right, he doesn't learn a lot of lessons and doesn't have a huge character arc. But I also think that is tremendously representative of Powell and Pressburger's view on, again, the British Empire at that time and their experience with that.
Yeah. So let me ask you, because, we spent a lot of time here, like, what you just told me about Clive is not something that's necessarily like a likable quality. You're talking about he's this guy who doesn't really appreciate people and everything.
Right.
Like, people are just something to collect to him. So like, what then is it that you do like about Clive? Because we spent so much time talking about the many ways in which this character is of fault and all the reasons that I sort of didn't like him or care for him and didn't want to spend 3 hours. So what was it that you did like about him that attracted you to him?
This is a really interesting conversation. I wasn't really expecting to talk about this, but based on what you're telling me, and like now that I'm kind of digging it up in my head, I'm almost envisioning Clive Wynn-Candy as like a British Empire military general version of Ferris Bueller.
Life moves pretty fast. You don't stop and look around once in a while, You could miss it.
Is it that
Absolutely
he's kind of like
charming.
charming and carefree? Is that
Yep.
kind of where the
Tons
appeal
of
comes
moxie,
from?
fun to watch on screen.
Okay.
We go through this, we go through his life instead of a day. With Ferris Bueller, it's just a day in Chicago. But we go through his life through a couple of wars, and it all kind of ends up okay for him, just like it does for Ferris Bueller at the end. And it's been argued over the years that he's the villain. Cameron is actually the hero of that story. He's the protagonist and the sympathetic character. And I would argue that in many ways, Theo is the Cameron of this story.
Powell and Pressburger influencing John Hughes 40 years later.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. When Theo was in Egypt land.
Let my Cameron go.
Yeah.
That's awesome, man. Now, I did want to say, you had mentioned that the moment that Deborah Kerr's character gets up top where she's kind of being like a little bit sassy with Clive. And I actually really enjoyed that moment.
Yeah.
And, they're sort of there, they're talking at the bar and, she's basically letting him know like, yeah, well, you men have been out there playing soldiers. We women have been at home and we've been doing some thinking. We've been thinking about our role in society and the roles that we play and all of that.
I say,
You see, while you men have been fighting, we women have been thinking. Think for yourself, Mr. Candy. What careers are there open to a woman? She can get married.
I was just going to
Yes,
say.
but supposing she doesn't want to get married, she can go and be a governess. But what does a governess know, Mr. Candy? Nothing, I assure you. Then what can she teach the children who are in her charge? Very little except good manners, if she herself has good manners.
Good manners are important.
Did you learn that in South Africa, Mr. Candy?
It's kind of just, it's almost similar to that Theo moment later on in the film where he's lamenting his loss, where it's kind of just 1 or 2 minutes for a character to talk. And you almost get the sense that it's really the filmmakers and the writers doing the talking or letting the characters talk for them, right? It's just them sort of just saying, hey, here's my views on this thing for a minute. And one of the more interesting aspects and hallmarks of Powell and Pressburger films that I've noticed is each of the films gets that moment where a character just sort of monologues for a couple minutes. And it's really the filmmakers letting the world know about their position on something important. And a lot of it has to do with World War II and Nazism because it's the early 40s. And so, of course, that was the, big what was going on with the world at the time. And yeah, so I loved that in this one, it was sort of a moment for them to talk about, the role that women play in society at the time and sort of being repressed and giving them more of like a foot forward. In 49th Parallel, which was, I believe, their first collaboration together, there is a moment where they meet sort of like a cult leader, and he has this very stirring monologue where he gets up and he talks about refuting Nazism and all of the reasons. And they're also actually very Christian filmmakers. They're very pro-Christian. And then I think it was in A Canterbury Tale, which I've also seen of theirs, there's a moment where they do the same thing, and it's talking about sort of remembering history, and having a certain reverence for history and those that have come before us and our ancestors and all of that. So I really like that in each of their films, they sort of take that just like 1 to 3 moments and let a character monologue just to say, hey, here's my view on life, sociology, politics, etc. And so that was a really good one that they had in this film as well. Now, let's discuss the narrative arc and the plot points of the film, man, because, I have to say, when I sit here and I analyze everywhere we went and what we did and didn't do and where we didn't go over the course of these 3 hours, I'm left feeling kind of unsatisfied because I don't feel like, we had a real cohesive through line. We've talked about this before, but like, there's not really a real MacGuffin to speak of, so to speak. Certainly one, not that I identified. There's certain, if you wanted to sort of make one, you could kind of say that he wanted Edith or, one of her versions, but like, I didn't feel like that was his impetus for doing what he did.
Sure.
So the film has a lot of narrative ellipses, and we talked a lot about this in our Tokyo story because that was the first time that we had seen a filmmaker do that with Ozu. And for anyone who is watching that doesn't know that term, a narrative ellipses is basically when the filmmakers decide not to show you a certain action, right? So generally speaking, if we're building towards a big battle, the filmmaker is going to deliver you that battle, but a certain type of filmmaker may decide, you know what, I don't want this film to be about the battles. I want it to be about the characters. So I'm not going to show you the battle. I'm actually just going to skip over that. And we're going to go straight into the aftermath. We would call that a narrative ellipses. And this film does that quite a lot. And especially with anything that might be considered a sort of action scene or something like that. Right.
Right.
As a matter of fact, the film takes what I feel should have been a very satisfying duel between Clive and Theo. That's the way that they're introduced is, you know, they demand satisfaction from Clive after he pulled the whole stunt with the orchestra in the bar playing the English tunes. And so one of the German soldiers has to fight them. They draw straws, I believe, and Theo gets selected. And, you know, I ask myself, I'm like, okay, so what is it that we pick up and lose as a result of this narrative ellipses taking place? And in a film that's, you know, almost 3 hours and goes so far out of its way to not have action scenes. Personally, I would have loved to have had a good 5-minute sword fight, you know? And even if it was a gentlemanly sword fight where they, you know, thrust, and then they stop and then it's like, oh, you know, one-liner, clever thing, right? Like a little bit of Princess Bride or something, right? That would have been great especially because of the fact that their relationship, you know, Theo and Clive's, is really what I would say is sort of the bulk of the story here. You know, I think that's what this film hangs its hat on as a through line, is the developing relationship between Clive and Theo. So for their relationship to be centered around this encounter, I would have loved to have seen that encounter to know the genesis of the relationship that we're going to be spending so much time with. So the filmmakers decided not to show me that. And I think about it and I'm like, I don't know that I gained anything. Like, if you're telling me that, you know, you want to keep the focus on the characters and the characterization, I actually think that scene could have delivered more of that, you know? So again, that was a sort of a duel that I would have loved to have seen between the two men that ultimately sets up what their long and storied friendship is. And that's just kind of like one of many examples I could cite. So do you disagree with that? Do you feel like the film had a compelling plot?
But I disagree. I agree with you, but in a different way. And I'll clarify by saying that I liked the omission of the duel. I thought it was done very well. I thought that the pullback outside of that gymnasium that they were in after, you know, all the pomp and circumstance of the getting ready, and all the tradition, and, you know, he rips off his sleeve and
setting
all of
the rules. I did think that was interesting too. You know, you kind of forget where they're sort of like two gentlemen coming together and like establishing, what do they call it? The rules of engagement, right? Yes. It's not something we see a lot in film. So I did enjoy that.
Yeah. And the respect for each other and all of that. For starters, you know, in 1943, how do you show two guys? Like, I mean, I guess you could show, like you said, like a little bit of sword play.
Errol Flynn, Robin Hood, come on.
But you can't show these, like, because we go back to the hospital at this, after that, the infirmary, and they have like fucked each other up. Like, the dude can't hear. They've slashed each other's faces all up. Why they don't have huge scars later in the film, I don't know. But supposedly it was, you know, they did some damage to each other. And I don't know that you could show that in 1942, 1943. You know, he says he's going to, you know, cut the man's ear off and all of that. So I would argue, though, that if I was going to hang my hat on something I wish I would have seen more of, it was his time in the infirmary with Theo. Because that, I think, is where their friendship was forged, in the time that they spent hanging out together, just, you know, drinking wine and recovering. And, you know, old gal Edith was there, and that's where Theo, you know, fell in love with Edith. We didn't really see any of those moments. And so I agree with you. There is something missing there, but I don't think it's the duel. I think I would argue that it's the time in the infirmary spent together and like all their bond, the bond that Clive Wynn-Candy has with Edith, you know, to kind of showcase why he misses her later, or why he might be imprinting that on people later. We don't see a lot of their banter. And when we do, it's handled very casually and off the cuff. And then his time with Theo is almost non-existent because Theo can't speak English, just a couple of lines, really.
Theo knows only two English expressions, very much and not very much. Stimmt's, Theo?
Very much.
You know, I would have liked to have seen them try to communicate. If they couldn't speak the same language, have a little more time together, you know, doing things that weren't language-based. Like, you know, just in a very Lieutenant Dan, Forrest Gump kind of way, in the same way.
It's funny that you bring that up because I was actually going to say, stay with me here, but do you remember the movie Days of Thunder with Tom Cruise?
Okay, I'll stay with you here. Carry on.
I don't know if you remember this sequence, but it's like there's him and his rival. I forget who plays his rival, but they both get very injured in like a crash. And then they end up being in the hospital and they're like recuperating together, but they're still rivals. And so they're constantly doing things as they're healing to like compete with one another down to the standpoint that like once they get into the wheelchairs, they have that like wheelchair race through the entire hospital that they do. Right. Yep. I would have loved to have seen more of that, but that's
what I'm talking about.
But the filmmakers were so committed to like not doing anything action based that like they don't give us chances to do that. And again, if you're going to make a 3-hour movie, I think you had plenty of time to do stuff like that. And so I think, again, maybe it wasn't an ellipses because it never happened, but it was certainly an omission from the screenplay and the story development. And I just think that having more action based, which can still be born out of character, but more action based sequences to kind of liven up the pacing. I mean, let me ask you, so you didn't feel like the film was slow? You thought it moved along pretty well?
Yes, because the characters were so engaging.
Okay.
It was a character-based movie, and everybody is so, I couldn't help but think of Candy and Theo's friendship as somewhat symbolic of Powell and Pressburger's relationship together. Emerich moved to England from Hungary to escape the Nazis. I kind of mentioned that in the beginning of the show. Mm-hmm. It's my understanding that Theo's monologues that you mentioned earlier about Nazism were a direct reflection of what Emerich had dealt with in his home country. A lot of the department heads, like Alfred Young, for example, had left Germany for the same reason. So, there's a lot of personal reflection and personal statements about what was going on in the world at this time. And those moments are what I'm hanging my hat on about what I loved about this film, the character study of it all, and the representation of Journal Clive Wynn-Candy's, representation of the British stance, and then Theo's representation of a sympathetic German, which at the time was not done. We haven't even talked about the hot water that these guys got into, Powell and Pressburger got into with the British government, because Winston Churchill didn't want anything to do with a sympathetic Nazi or a sympathetic German.
Correct.
They were the enemy, clear cut. And the second you start to crack that nut of, oh, well, they're human, we have to feel sympathy for them, or some of these people are in a certain situation or they want out or whatever, then man, now I got a whole moral quandary I got to deal with, because we're over there just, trying to kill these dudes and annihilate Nazism. So, I think that, this is a deeper film than just what about the sword fight,
Of course.
It's more of a character study. And it's also, a life study of watching this man grow old and like the things that made him into the, salty old crotchety man that we see at the beginning of the film, and love lost and his friendship with Theo and all the interpersonal relationships. But I do not disagree with you that Clive Wynn-Candy is, in many, many ways unsympathetic. But I do think that's by design. Even when his house gets bombed and blows up, he has a driver during the war that named Murdoch that he, brings with him or whatever, and ends up being his right-hand man of sorts. And he dies in that bombing. Murdoch dies in that bombing. And Clive Wynn-Candy doesn't really show a lot of remorse about that. That was his straight up homie. Like, he took care of him. He was his number two throughout the war, throughout after the war. He moves into his house and becomes more or less his butler and stuff. And so, I thought that I do agree with you that Clive Wynn-Candy, was kind of demonstrated throughout the film as an unsympathetic character, and Theo is the heart and soul of this film.
Yeah, and I actually have a note here regarding the pacing here, that it's probably, I'm like finding the pacing prodding, but also could be a result of being disengaged with story and characters. So that does kind of speak to what you were mentioning before. But also, I do just want to clarify, when I talk about having certain action scenes, that's not just for the sake of hey, let's blow some stuff up, I'm getting bored, da-da-da. What I'm talking about is showing us these actions that end up having very severe circumstances. And I think the filmmakers try to have it both ways.
Sure.
And I think another example of this, like I pointed to the duel earlier, that's fine. But I think we also see this, reinforced when we look at the moment where the Germans, quote unquote, finally accept armistice, right? Which like was a big moment in real life.
Yeah.
But the thing is like, okay, so, the Germans have laid down their weapons. If you don't put me in the war and you don't show me that, like that moment means nothing to me because you haven't given me a moment to sit in like, oh, isn't war horrible? So that when it's, called off, it's like, great. And then they also do something that I think was kind of cheap where in that moment, despite the fact that we haven't had any war, we see them and, it's like, war, it's called and war ceases. And then immediately we hear like the bird chirping amidst all of like, the horrible atrocities that have been going on, right? We're finally coming out of war. Which would have been such an awesome moment if it was motivated. And I'm sure somebody's actually done that moment since really well, right? But again, by not having me sit in any of the atrocities of the war, it doesn't provide me any relief to come out of it. You know what I mean?
It was done really well in All Quiet on the Western Front, which you still need to see. It's on Netflix streaming. So
yeah.
That was
nice, absolutely.
That moment was portrayed very well because that one was one that you took you into the trenches of World War I and you get to see the atrocities. And then when the war is over, it's like, oh shit, okay.
Yeah, and I can imagine that was something like that was really resonant in real life, right? Like you don't realize, like, wow, it's been years since we've heard birds chirping, right? I'm sure that was a really wonderful moment. So, but let's discuss the central themes of the film. Both the nature of what those themes are saying, as well as sort of the volume of their substance as it relates to the film. And when I consider the film's primary message, it seems to me to be primarily centered around the value of civility in times of peace, but most especially in times of war. And that a country and its people should really never stoop so low as to fight dirty, even if it's an enemy as ruthless as the Nazis are. So what I'd like to know, Ryan, is, first of all, do you agree with that statement with regards to that being a theme of the film? And then if so, do you actually agree with the sentiment of the statement?
As far as like right makes might, like Clive Wynn-Candy says throughout the film?
Yeah.
Versus Theo's stance of you got to fight fire with fire or else the fire is going to burn your fucking house down. More or less. Because that's basically what it is. Is Theo's like, look, dude, like you're fighting an enemy you know nothing about, right? It's like aliens or something, dude. It's like you don't know what you're up against. You can't treat this normally, Yeah, he's the Sigourney Weaver of this situation.
Crazy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, 100%. But Clive is like, no, like we can't do that to ourselves. To do that to ourselves is to debase ourselves and make us less than men. And you can, especially knowing what you know about Powell and Pressburger now, you can sort of hear that echoing their position. So I'm just wondering what you think about that theme, and if you think that it even is a theme that's presented in the film, or if
no, it definitely is. I don't think it's a theme that
okay.
has a direct answer. I think that proposes it as a moral quandary in the sense that, you could, if you don't fight fire with fire and realize what you're up against, that these people don't give a crap about your tradition and all of that, then you're going to lose. And you guys are all going to have to you guys are all going to be speaking German next year. So just realize that, like, you can keep your traditions, but this isn't the Boer War. This is a world war, and this guy's a madman, and he's coming for you. He's bombing your house. You are now living in your club now because you no longer have a house. It's now a well. So, but the other side is, to win the war, what do we have to become? And what will we be left with afterwards? And so, you gotta, to beat the devil, you gotta get a little devil in you and go become a little evil and get your hands dirty. It's not going to be pretty the way you have to win this, but you do have to win this. So it's a sad circumstance. And I think it's proposed as such in the sense that, yes, you are going to have to go, become a little bit of what they are. You got to, get down in the trenches with them, unfortunately, and ground and pound with these guys. But just know that on the other side, it will change you. And that's, I think, the unfortunate thing that Powell and Pressburger are toying with here and kind of pitching to the audience. And so there's no right answer. It's not like, oh no, you have to do this. I mean, you do have to go do that because you don't want to be a Nazi. So, right. So you got to beat the Nazis. So the answer is yes, you do have to go, hang your traditions up. It occurred to me during that moment in the film when they're talking about all the traditions and how you got to go get your hands dirty, all the way back to our Revolutionary War here in America. That was at least how we were taught in school. That's one of the ways that we won as Americans and got our freedom away from Britain, was because they were all lining up with their pomp and circumstance and tradition. And we were like hanging out in trees and going, jungle hunting. And, we didn't give a shit about their, lining up and tradition and you shoot and then I shoot and then you shoot and then I shoot. It's like, no, bro, I'm fighting to win. Like, I want my freedom and you're in my way and I'm coming for you. And we won. So I think it was that hubris and that overconfidence that, allowed them to just say, we'll just rely on our traditions. And Theo's like, no, you can't, not this time. Like, you're about to lose this. Like, you're losing the whole empire, bro. This guy's coming for your throat. And, but what, to ditch those traditions and values, what is it going to make you? I think that's a question that it doesn't have an answer, and something that as a culture or society, or just humanity in general, still wrestles with to this very day, and makes this movie still relevant in many ways.
Now, the last thing I would like to discuss before we go is the nature of this film conceptually as a satire. Now, I will admit, as I was watching this film, I did not pick up on the fact that it was a satire, and maybe there are elements of it that are satirical, but I was very surprised to find in some of my research online that both the filmmaker's intentions as well as the acceptance of the critical body at large was that this film sort of is a satire. And so, Ryan, first, what I'll ask is, did this film work for you as satire? And if so, why or why not?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that this was a relationship movie. I think that to me, at least the way it impacted me all these years later, some of it's an interesting topic because, some of this stuff might have felt more like a satire in the context of its time and its day. Remember, it came out in 1943 in the middle of the war. So you could only say so much, or, even the slightest bit of criticism of the British Army and all of that, came off really strong. And so, maybe some of that satire outer layer is lost over time because we're not in it anymore, and we're not from there. Yeah. So we don't know. But it didn't impact me that way. So if you're asking my personal opinion, I'll tell you, I don't think it was a satire to me. To me, it was more of a relationship movie. It was the bromance between Theo and Wynn-Candy. It was the, idealized love between Edith and Wynn-Candy and how he imposed that on other people. It's all the times he made mistakes and how, he learned or didn't learn from that moving forward. So, I thought that, to me, it was more of an interpersonal relationship film.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things I thought about is maybe like, from what I've learned of Powell and Pressburger, that these like very genuine people. And I almost wonder if they're just like too genuine for like effective satire, right? Like effective satire is from like the smart asses of the world, So I always wonder if these two dudes are almost just like too goodly and too honest, people to have, really just twist the knife at some sort of concept. But dude, Ryan, great discussion today. Really appreciate your insights. Let's go ahead and finish this episode as we do every episode with 3 scenes where we discuss the 3 scenes that we feel best represent our reaction to this movie. Ryan, you can start.
3 scenes that stood out to me. One I just have to point out real quick is the animal heads time passage scene. Where throughout the film, anytime they wanted to skip ahead by a few years or a decade, they would go through his trophy room that he inherits his house from his aunt, and then they would go through and show all the trophies or animals that he's killed and where he was and what year it was. So any passage of time scene in this film I thought was handled very amazing. You mentioned right up top the swimming pool where he comes up. 40 years earlier. I would even argue an awesome passage of time scene that gets overlooked, and I haven't really heard it mentioned much in my research for this film, is when he's looking through his photo album, and then he's spending all the time with his wife, and then he comes up on all the empty pages because she's passed away, and it just shows all the missing memories that weren't there. It was very reminiscent to me of that opening scene from Up, when we go through the photo album and show their time together and all of that. One of the saddest scenes in cinema history, the opening scene from Up.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really handled really well. Again, shot by Jack Cardiff, who was the camera operator, but they let him have that scene and come up with that whole montage. And then he went on to go work with them in the future on a bunch of their other films like Black Narcissus that we will cover on this show here shortly. I know you said you didn't like The Duel. I really liked The Duel. The omission of it all, I thought was handled really well. That was all we really had to hang our hat on because, again, we didn't really get their relationship in the hospital and we didn't see them actually fight. So that was the first introduction between him and Theo and their close relationship. And lastly, you have to give it up to Theo's monologue about Nazism and the personal touch there from Pressburger. Again, like you said, it starts off Access and then kind of swings around where Theo is looking right down the barrel of the camera pretty much and talking to you, the viewer, about Nazism and the evils and how his kids had left him to be Nazis and the, threat that was on their doorstep. Again, 1943, that had to hit so hard to be in a theater and have like the whole movie kind of stop that up until that point had been kind of swanky and moving along and super fun and charming. And then all of a sudden here's this sympathetic German, again, not something you see very often back then, looking to you as a British person or American and saying, this is what the villain is. And, it's going to change your way of life. It's threatening everything we hold dear. So I thought that Theo's monologue was very special as well. How about you, Jason?
Yeah, absolutely. So my first scene that I really loved is the swimming pool transition. I said up top, this film contained one of my all-time favorite film transitions, and this is it. It's a stellar moment that reflects the great visual language of the film and of Powell and Pressburger as filmmakers. The second significant scene that I have is when German armistice is announced. I talked about it just a little bit ago. And this would be the sort of like illustration of the negative aspect of the filmmaking, where, again, this proclamation arrives with zero fanfare, and so none of it's been earned. It's such a pivotal moment for the war. It's supposed to be the end of this long-suffering torment because we didn't get to live in that war, as we addressed earlier. The moment means nothing. So, that way the addition of that relief of the bird chirping, it also kind of feels unearned a little bit. And then for my third scene, it is as well the narrative ellipsis of the Clive-Theo duel. And I think it's interesting that for as much as you liked that was as much as I didn't like that, Like this was a moment that I wanted so bad. I really wanted to see where we started, at the negative side of things so that we could watch this great relationship arc take place over the course of the film. Much the same way that I feel like Colonel Blimp doesn't really have much of an arc. It's just kind of this little, profound understanding at the end. I feel like it's the same thing with their relationship. And again, I really would have liked a lot more moments to establish that bond that proves so important throughout the film.
Fair.
So with all that said, Ryan, we can go ahead and formalize our star ratings. And I hate that I am giving Colonel Blimp 2.5 out of 5 stars. Very, very mediocre experience for me. I know a lot of people love this one. I was totally expecting to love it, but this is now the 4th Powell and Pressburger film that I've seen. 5th, if you count Thief of Baghdad, that Powell did without Pressburger. And this is probably my least favorite of them, though admittedly I didn't really love Thief of Baghdad much as well. So how about you, man? What is your formal star rating for Colonel Blimp here?
I'm giving this one 5 stars. This one really hit home for me. I loved everything about it.
Full 5. Dude, that is insane.
Couple things. Number one, I'm not a huge guy for 3-hour movies. I would watch this again right now. I loved this film.
Wow.
This was so much fun. And if you're telling me that this is one of their lesser films, I'm so looking forward to getting deeper into this series with you because they take a lot of the technical aspects of this film that I love so much. Again, the set design, cinematography, music by Alan Gray. Those guys went on with, the Archers, Powell and Pressburger, to go.
All of that is in their future films.
Black Narcissus, Red Shoes, all these other films. So looking forward to getting deeper into this with you as we move forward into our series covering Powell and Pressburger. But yes, this was a 5-star film. Great way to start for me. Long live General Clive Wynn-Candy.
What's funny is what's going to happen is you're going to hate all of the other films now. All the ones I love, you hate, and vice versa. So it is all downhill from here for Ryan, for Powell and Pressburger.
I hope you're wrong. I really hope you're wrong.
I'm sure that I will. Now, if you enjoyed this review, we are going to ask that you go ahead and subscribe to our channel or follow if you're listening to the podcast. As well, if you enjoyed this episode, go ahead and like that. You can leave us a comment on YouTube about what you thought about the film. If you listen to the podcast, you can send us an email, esotericacinema@gmail.com. We would love to hear what you think. And then you can always go to our website, esotericacinema.com, for more information and some additional content. For myself, Jason Peters, and my good friend Ryan Seybold, this has been Esoterica Cinema. Keep appreciating film and enjoy the movies.